We so are, in keeping with fine tradition of all tech conferences, we're a little bit behind at the get-go. So, real quick show of hands, how many folks actually know something about network service mesh at this point? How many are familiar with it? Okay, and how many are just coming here to get their first exposure to what's going on? Okay. So how many of you feel like you could explain what is network service mesh? Yeah, fewer. So what I'm going to talk about here today really briefly as part of the sort of launch off 5-minute keynote is what is network service mesh? So network service mesh started out as a good idea, right? Good ideas evolve. The original idea with network service mesh was looking around at Kubernetes and cloud native networking. Now Kubernetes networking is awesome if the thing you want to do is the thing that it does. It's really well done. It's also really good if you are doing stuff that lives basically within your cluster, intra-cluster networking. But there were a whole host of problems that people were coming up with that actually didn't fit particularly in that box. They'd done a good job of optimizing for the average case in Kubernetes networking, but there were a whole bunch of other use cases people wanted to solve in networking. And there were a bunch of ideas bubbling up at the time. But so many of those ideas sort of could be summarized as, take the last thing we did and let's just do it here again. And cloud native, at a very fundamental level, is about rethinking everything, deciding what actually solves real problems for application developers, and doing that. So the idea started with, what if we were to reimagine networking in a cloud native way in the broad? And it sort of evolved. At that point, Istio had just become a thing. Service mesh was very hot. There were a ton of ideas in the air to borrow. And so the very first conceptualization of network service mesh was to say, okay, it's like service mesh, only for L2 and L3 payloads, things like IP and Ethernet. And that was a good place to start. Doesn't really speak strongly to developers, but you got to start somewhere. And then it evolved a little bit from there, because as code was developed and as the community started getting a sense of what it was doing, we came to realize that the really fundamental thing that we were doing that was interesting was allowing individual workloads, at the granularity of a workload, to be connected by virtual wires to something that was providing the network service they wanted. Where that network service could be any set of things that you need, because how many folks here actually have deep background in networking? How many of you actually think you get a good result if you have something that can do all the things at once and they're all turned on? Yeah. Most of the things you want from your network are actually at some level mutually incompatible with each other. There is some service you want from your network, and you want to be able to pick the one that meets your needs. So the idea continued to evolve, because as we started exploring more deeply, what we realized was that we could actually have network service domains that floated independent of individual clusters. So now you could talk about connectivity domains expressed as network services that could have, at the granularity of workloads join from multiple different Kubernetes clusters. And then we realized that effectively at the end of the day, you can think about everything in these terms. You could even think about the things you're used to getting from your physical network this way, which is important because there are a small number of cases, but important and lucrative, where people want to be able to get something from their physical network from a pod. And it turns out exactly the same way of thinking about things applies here, because you can think about the port on your top of rack switch as providing a network service, and the combination of your NIC and the wire that literally is going to that port, possibly with something in-cappy going on in between, as providing that virtual wire. And we started to realize that by conceptualizing things in terms of virtual wires connected to network services, instead of thinking about the entire world as a vSwitch that does a relatively narrow prescribed set of things, that we could actually open up a huge space for innovation. And that's actually what we're here for today, is to talk about the many innovative things that people have been building around these ideas. So as we continue to evolve, as the sun is rising on network service mesh, we are going to continue to, as a community, expand this idea. So I'm incredibly fond of this quote. I don't know how many of you are science fiction fans. Louis McMaster-Bujold is a science fiction author I highly recommend. She has a quote which says, "All true wealth is biological." And it's absolutely true. And if you doubt it for a moment, ask yourself, for any piece of software that you actually like, If I gave you the choice between losing every line of code or every software developer involved with it, which would you pick? And I would maintain 100% of the time you would pick the developers if given that choice, because the real wealth is in the communities that you build around these things. And so when you really get down to what network service mesh is the community that evolves the idea of network service mesh forward, that continually improves on it and builds on it, comes to stronger realizations about it. And that's what we're here today to do. We have an entire slate of talks from the community where people are going to be talking about the things that they have been doing, their contributions to evolving forward the idea of network service mesh, bringing it to new arenas of application, thinking about it in slightly improved ways, or in sometimes radically improved ways. So I do want to take a brief moment and thank our sponsors. We've had a number of sponsors who have kindly provided funding to make this event possible, and we do very much appreciate their support. Thank you.